The soil is rich and fertile, and you can clear all the land you want and plant practically any crop you desire, and it will grow with vitality. Unspoiled streams are everywhere. The water is pure and good, and may be diverted to irrigate your fields. The wilderness is so rich in game that there is no possible shortage of meat. The people are happy and busy and prosperous. End of speech. No sooner did he finish his brief continued answer than outright disclaim once again erupted. A particularly angry man stood to take charge, shouting above the rest, "How can you possibly account for prosperity in the colonies?" The audience so celebrated this denunciation that again for some while it was impossible to speak. Franklin patiently blinked back at them, disbelieving himself that they could prescribe such unreasonable limits to the truth. When they finally quieted, he told them exactly how he could account for prosperity in the colonies. "It's quite simple," he said. "We have created our own currency." Again, a great uproar erupted. Who were the colonists to create their own currency? How could a currency possibly account for prosperity? The former is no longer understood to be a right and responsibility, and the latter is doubted in this very style even today. Franklin explained that if, for instance, a first man raises fowl, and a second raises feed, and the first intends in the next season to double his production, he may approach the second, wanting him to produce additional feed required. They agree how much of the production of each will be traded to the other, and their eventual contracts are evidence of their promises to deliver to each other. What we've been discussing are promissory notes. Their notes may then be circulated as currency, he goes on to say. The cultivator of the feed, for instance, may write a note against the fowl to be delivered to him to pay for a doctor to take care of his family, the very story I was telling you the other day. The doctor may pay for goods with the same note at the local store. The store then will ultimately collect the fowl originally promised to the cultivator. When the production is delivered, the respective notes are fulfilled and the money passes from circulation. Just what we were explaining. Without even a need for administration, the circulation is perpetually regulated according to need. There is no inflation or deflation because the circulation always arises and passes with the life and consumption of the production. I'm going to interrupt there a bit because that point is the very thing that these people are missing. Unless there's an obligation to pay it out of circulation, which obligation they are going to have to perform if they succeed in their claim of eradicating or minimizing inflation, the same obligation exists. So in effect, what I'm telling you, well, I'll explain at the end of this story. Let me read that paragraph again. Without even a need for administration, the circulation is perpetually regulated according to need, simply by collection of the notes or payment of principal out of circulation. There is no inflation or deflation because the circulation always arises and passes with the life and consumption of the production. Neither, therefore, do we suffer multiplication of debt by interest. In fact, the very ability of the people to issue their promises to pay itself makes it possible to sustain whatever prosperity we are capable of. Well, I hate to inform you folks, but those aren't the words of Benjamin Franklin. So, I go on in the story. We finish what Franklin has just said. So far had his English cousins deviated from this natural pattern that the rectitude of a populace issuing a just currency was even an affront to them. The very quests of his audience for unearned profit too deprived the general population not only of their production, but of the very opportunity to produce. In fact, this very audience enjoyed undeserved advantages which they presumed would disappear if the people were allowed to prosper in rectitude. Sound familiar? The transparent facts of their existence could prove no match for the arguments of demonstrable solution. Same thing that applies today. They even intended to remain a cause of the very problems the colonist solution addressed. Lacking any basis whatever for refutation, and wanting yet to denounce Franklin, sound familiar? They were at least relieved when finally the same angry man shouted above the murmuring everywhere. "That's preposterous," the man shouted. "How could you levy taxes or fund government with this mere scrip?" Laughter and sarcasm erupted. Franklin was now openly ridiculed. Again, Mr. Franklin simply waited to explain. Finally he replied, "That's quite simple as well." He stood letting the next while pass that they could ruminate their repeated mistake of presuming he might not answer capably. Suppose we have a township on one side of a river which is unnavigable and unfordable, and an opposing township on the other. One of these townships might build a lumber mill, the other builds a grist mill. Foreseeing the eventual need to support activity above initial demands, each builds their mill to greater capacities than first required. As each township needs the services of the other township's mills, eventually it is proposed to build a bridge across the river. A group of men then agree to build the bridge to agreed standards, and when we agree on a fee to pay them for this service, likewise, we simply create the necessary notes and pay them. So here's this idea of spending money into circulation, which I'm about to invalidate, but as I tell it in this story. As the increased commerce requires the increased circulation to sustain it, there is no inflation. That's not true. And therefore, we have provided in all ways to sustain the desired commerce. Almost. Pretty darn close, but not quite, and there's a big problem. So the last paragraph of this response that I have Benjamin Franklin uttering, which are my own words, to fund the proper services of government, such as the creation of this bridge, we have no need to levy taxes or to subject our people to eternal multiplication of debt. We have provided the real service of government without cost. In my story I go on to say then, blood would be shed for his excellent explanation. Franklin's heckler was an officer of the Bank of England, seated with several officers of Parliament. Common sense tells the rest of the story. The very following day, the Bank of England, their Parliament passed a resolution outlawing colonial scrip as currency. In a mere guise of propriety, the future Americans were required to turn in their vital scrip for bonds issued by the Bank of England. Although they were to be paid some menial interest for the bonds, however, the bonds too were outlawed as circulation. Lawful trade was impossible. To no surprise, then, the provision allowed the colonists to turn in the bonds for notes issued by the Bank of England. These notes alone could they use as currency, and to their further disadvantage, they were required to pay some 30% annual interest for the usurped circulation. Thus, for explaining the wisdom of true economy, Franklin was forced to take the news of perpetual multiplication of debt back to his people. As we know today, the colonists rejected this crime against them and prevailed in the ensuing military conflict. The House of Rothschild, under the guise of a Bank of England, would pay for Hessian mercenaries to subdue the colonists. Washington's famous crossing of the Delaware would thus defeat the Hessians encamped at Trenton, hired to enforce a plutocracy. Yet even the real nature of the conflict would disappear from history, thanks to us. These crimes against the colonists would fail at great cost of life. But the banks which had been established here would succeed. With interest perpetually multiplying debt upon the new land, political subversion would readily be purchased with illimitable unearned profit. Attempts to eternalize usury would fail under the illuminated leaders of the young nation, but would finally succeed in 1913 under corruption and ineptitude which prevails to this day. And in the style of all banks, which are named what they are not, the eventual private central bank of America will be called the Federal Reserve, even as it is neither federal nor a reserve of anything. Words of Mike Montagne, which are in tens of thousands of places all over the internet nowadays. But these are later chapters of our story, and we are only at its beginning. The governments of Europe, of course, were threatened by the infectious ideas and courage of the Revolution. Few Europeans, therefore, dared openly support the colonial efforts. Mere contact put lives in danger. Friendships, however deep, were at least temporarily cut off. In restoring one such relationship after the war, Franklin explained the real cause of the American Revolution in a conciliatory letter to a friend in France. He said, quote, "We would have gladly borne the little tax on tea and other matters, had it not been that they took from us our money, which created great unemployment and dissatisfaction. Within a year, the poorhouses were filled. The hungry and homeless walked the streets everywhere." So I provide an addendum to this article, which exists in my previous web pages. This story speaks for itself, especially when you realize that it's only a little part true, and that I've taken literary license to explain the idea of mathematically perfected economy through the mouth of Benjamin Franklin in a mere parable, which every plagiarist who's published it as a real fact of history has exposed himself by in terms of their plagiarism, or their claims that this currency was not inflationary. Well, Ellen Hodgson Brown, as I pointed out last week, had claimed that this was the most brilliant banking model in our nation's history. Well, thank you, Ellen. I'm very flattered, But you did not find that this was the account of how the bank operated in your researches of history. And why not? And why is it that you couldn't explain how this currency was non-inflationary, which you claimed? And these are, this is, I hope, still evident in your remarks at Op-Ed News, where we debated this matter, and you left the debate after the question. But I'll explain the answer now, which you can offer the people, and that is that this was inflationary for a very important reason. They paid for the bridge by just spending the money in a